Captain Derek Sullivan stormed across the federal courthouse parking lot, barked orders at 3 junior officers, shoved past courthouse security, and grabbed the black woman by her arm before slamming her against his patrol car. "You're under arrest for interfering with police business," the 20-year veteran shouted, pressing his knee into her back while she calmly stated, "Captain, I am Federal Judge Rebecca Washington, and you need to step back immediately." The racist officer laughed until she recited his badge number, his supervisor's name, and the exact federal statute he was violating, details that only someone with supreme judicial authority would know. What Captain Sullivan didn't realize was that attacking the wrong person in the wrong place would trigger consequences he never saw coming. He thought he was dealing with just another citizen who needed to be put in her place. He was wrong. What happened in the next 72 hours would change everything he thought he knew about power, authority, and the price of one moment of racist arrogance. This is the story of how one decision destroyed everything, and why you'll never forget what comes next. It was 8:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, when two very different worlds collided in the most catastrophic way possible outside the Richard B. Russell Federal Building in Atlanta, Georgia. Federal Judge Rebecca Washington had just concluded a grueling 14-hour day presiding over a complex federal racketeering case. At 45, she had earned her reputation as one of the most respected jurists in the Southern District of Georgia, known for her razor-sharp intellect, unwavering integrity, and calm demeanor under pressure. Tonight, she carried her leather briefcase containing sensitive federal case files as she walked toward her silver Mercedes in the courthouse's secure parking garage. 3 blocks away, Police Captain Derek Sullivan was having the worst month of his 20-year career. Budget cuts had intensified pressure from the mayor's office, his clearance rates were down 15%, and Internal Affairs had received 3 complaints about his officers' aggressive tactics in the past 2 weeks. At 52, Sullivan prided himself on being an old-school cop who believed in showing authority first and asking questions later. Tonight, he was leading a routine drug sweep operation that had yielded nothing but paperwork and frustrated officers. The call came in at 8:45 p.m. Suspicious activity reported near Federal Courthouse. Multiple individuals seen loitering in parking area. Sullivan's jaw tightened as he heard the address. Federal property meant federal oversight, federal paperwork, and federal headaches. But a call was a call, and Sullivan never backed down from asserting his authority, regardless of jurisdiction. Judge Washington had just reached her car when she noticed the unusual activity. 3 police cruisers had surrounded a group of young men near the visitor parking area. She paused, observing the scene with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades in the criminal justice system. Something felt off about the officers' positioning and their aggressive stance toward what appeared to be courthouse staff leaving their evening shifts. Sullivan arrived on scene in his department-issued Ford Explorer, emergency lights cutting through the humid Atlanta night. He surveyed the situation with growing irritation. His officers had detained 4 individuals, but it was clear this was going nowhere fast. The suspicious individuals turned out to be federal court clerks working late on case preparations. "This is a waste of time," Sullivan muttered to Officer Mike Torres, his newest team member. "But we're here now, so we're going to make sure everyone understands who's in charge." Judge Washington observed Sullivan's arrival and immediately recognized the dangerous shift in energy. In her years on the bench, she had seen this type of law enforcement officer before. The kind whose ego outweighed their judgment, whose need to demonstrate authority often led to violations of constitutional rights. As Sullivan approached the detained court employees, Judge Washington made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She locked her car and walked toward the scene, her federal judicial authority compelling her to ensure proper procedures were being followed on federal property. "Excuse me, officers," she said in her courtroom voice, clear and authoritative. "I'm wondering if I could understand the nature of this detention." Sullivan spun around, his face flushed with annoyance. In the dim parking lot lighting, he saw a well-dressed black woman in her 40s, carrying a briefcase questioning his authority. Every prejudice, every frustration, every ounce of his wounded ego crystallized into pure rage. But what Captain Sullivan didn't know was that the woman questioning his authority held the power to trigger federal protocols that would expose everything he'd spent 20 years building. And every second of what happened next was being recorded by courthouse security systems that never stopped watching. To understand what happened next, you need to know exactly who these two people were and why this particular collision was inevitable. Judge Rebecca Washington hadn't always worn judicial robes. 20 years earlier, she had been a civil rights attorney in Birmingham, Alabama, specializing in police misconduct cases. She had built her career methodically, winning case after case against departments that thought they were untouchable. Her appointment to the federal bench 5 years ago had been unanimously confirmed, a rare occurrence in today's political climate. What made Judge Washington particularly dangerous to someone like Captain Sullivan was her encyclopedic knowledge of federal civil rights law. She had memorized every statute, every precedent, every procedural requirement that governed police interactions with citizens. More importantly, she understood the federal mechanisms that could be triggered when law enforcement officers violated constitutional rights on federal property. Captain Derek Sullivan represented everything Judge Washington had spent her career fighting against. His personnel file, if she had access to it, would have revealed a pattern that Internal Affairs had somehow overlooked for 2 decades. Excessive force complaints that were mysteriously withdrawn, witness testimonies that suddenly became unreliable, evidence that conveniently disappeared, settlements paid by the city that never made the newspaper. Sullivan had survived and thrived in the department because he understood how the system worked. He knew which supervisors to cultivate, which politicians to support, and which community leaders to charm. He had built a network of protection that had allowed him to operate with impunity for 20 years. But tonight, that protection was about to meet its match. "Ma'am, this is police business," Sullivan said, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "I'm going to need you to step back and let us handle this situation." Judge Washington remained perfectly still, her briefcase at her side, her posture radiating the quiet confidence of someone who had faced down hostile courtrooms, aggressive attorneys, and intimidating defendants without ever losing her composure. "Officer, I'm simply asking about the legal basis for this detention," she replied, her voice calm but carrying an undertone that should have warned Sullivan he was dealing with someone far more knowledgeable than he assumed. The other officers, Torres, Jackson, and Martinez, began to sense that something was shifting. They had worked with Sullivan long enough to recognize the warning signs when his temper was about to explode. But they also noticed something about this woman that made them uncomfortable. Her vocabulary, her posture, her complete lack of intimidation in the face of 4 armed officers, everything about her suggested she wasn't who Sullivan assumed she was. Sullivan's face darkened. In his mind, this was a simple equation. He was a police captain with 20 years of experience, and she was a civilian questioning his authority on the street. The fact that she was a black woman made it even more infuriating to him. In Sullivan's worldview, there was a natural hierarchy, and people needed to stay in their designated places. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask you again," Sullivan said, stepping closer to Judge Washington. "You need to move along right now, or you're going to find yourself in handcuffs." The court employees who had been detained were now watching this new confrontation with growing alarm. They recognized Judge Washington. She was one of the most senior judges in the building, but they were too far away to intervene or warn the officers about their catastrophic mistake. Judge Washington looked directly at Sullivan's badge, noting his number, 2847. She observed his name tag, D. Sullivan. She mentally catalogued the badge numbers of the other 3 officers. In federal court, details mattered, and Judge Washington never forgot a detail. "Captain Sullivan," she said, using his rank and name with precision, "I believe there may be some confusion about jurisdiction here. This is federal property, and these appear to be federal employees." The use of his name and rank should have been Sullivan's first warning. Civilians didn't typically know how to read police insignia or identify ranking officers, but Sullivan was too angry to notice the warning signs. Little did anyone know that this routine evening would expose a pattern that had been hidden for decades. Because Judge Washington wasn't just any federal judge. She was the one judge in the district with the authority to trigger immediate federal oversight of any law enforcement agency, and she had been quietly documenting patterns of police misconduct for years. What happened next would be replayed on news networks across the country, analyzed by legal experts, and studied in police academies as an example of how a single moment of poor judgment can destroy everything. Sullivan was now standing less than 3 feet from Judge Washington, his face flushed with anger, his hands clenched at his sides. 20 years of unquestioned authority had conditioned him to expect immediate compliance when he raised his voice. The fact that this woman remained calm and continued to challenge him was driving him toward a rage that would prove catastrophic. "Lady, I don't know who you think you are," Sullivan snarled, "but you're about to learn that when I give an order, you follow it. I don't care if you think you're some kind of lawyer or whatever." "Captain Sullivan," Judge Washington interrupted, her voice still controlled but now carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to controlling courtrooms filled with hostile attorneys and dangerous defendants. "I am Federal Judge Rebecca Washington of the Southern District of Georgia, and you are currently violating Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. 242, which prohibits the deprivation of constitutional rights under color of law." The words hit the other three officers like a physical blow. Officer Torres actually took a step backward. Officer Jackson's hand moved instinctively away from his weapon. Officer Martinez looked around nervously, suddenly aware of the federal courthouse security cameras that were undoubtedly recording every moment of this interaction. But Captain Sullivan, his vision clouded by rage and wounded pride, heard only one thing: a black woman telling him what he could and couldn't do. "I don't care if you're the Queen of England," Sullivan shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "You're interfering with police business, and you're going to learn some respect." Judge Washington remained motionless, but her mind was working with the precision of a judicial computer. She was mentally cataloging every violation of procedure, every constitutional transgression, every federal statute that was being broken in real time. More importantly, she was acutely aware that everything happening was being recorded by multiple federal security systems that would preserve this evidence forever. The transformation in the other officers was visible. They had gone from confident law enforcement professionals to men who suddenly realized they might be witnessing the end of their careers. Officer Torres, who had only been with the department for 8 months, looked like he was about to be sick. "Captain," Torres said quietly, "maybe we should—" "Shut up, Torres," Sullivan snapped. "This woman thinks she can come down here and tell us how to do our jobs. She's about to learn different." Judge Washington could see the trajectory of what was about to happen. She had spent decades in courtrooms watching people make decisions that would destroy their lives. She had seen defendants confess to crimes they didn't commit, attorneys sabotage their own cases, and prosecutors overreach in ways that invalidated years of investigation. But she had never seen someone about to commit professional suicide so completely and with such determination. "Captain Sullivan," she said, making one final attempt to prevent the catastrophe she could see coming, "I strongly advise you to contact your supervisor before this situation escalates further." Sullivan heard those words as the ultimate challenge to his authority. In his twisted logic, backing down now would represent a defeat that he could never recover from. The other officers were watching. The federal courthouse was in the background. This woman was questioning not just his judgment, but his very right to wear the badge. He made his decision. Sullivan stepped forward, grabbed Judge Washington by her left arm, and shoved her backward against his patrol car, with enough force to make her briefcase fall to the ground, scattering legal documents across the asphalt. "You're under arrest for interfering with police business," he shouted, pressing his knee into her back while reaching for his handcuffs. The sound of Judge Washington's briefcase hitting the ground echoed across the parking lot like a gunshot. Federal case files scattered in the humid Atlanta breeze. And in that moment, Captain Derek Sullivan crossed a line that would trigger consequences he couldn't even imagine. When the other officers realized who Captain Sullivan had just attacked, their faces went pale. Because attacking a federal judge isn't just assault. It's a federal crime that automatically triggers FBI involvement, and there's no going back. Officer Torres was the first to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. As Judge Washington's federal case files scattered across the parking lot, he could see the official seals, the federal court headers, the classified markings that indicated these weren't just any legal documents. "Captain," Torres said, his voice barely above a whisper, "Captain, I think—" But Sullivan was beyond listening. He had Judge Washington pressed against his patrol car, her hands behind her back, completely convinced that he was teaching a valuable lesson about respecting police authority. In his adrenaline-fueled state, he couldn't hear the horror in his officers' voices, or see the federal courthouse security guards who were now moving rapidly toward their location. Judge Washington, even with her face pressed against the cold metal of the police car, remained completely calm. Her years on the federal bench had taught her that panic was the enemy of justice, and that dignity under pressure was often the most powerful weapon against tyranny. "Captain Sullivan," she said, her voice muffled but still clear. "Badge number 2847. Your supervisor is Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, extension 4477. The federal statute you are currently violating carries a maximum penalty of 10 years in federal prison." The specificity of her knowledge hit the other officers like a lightning bolt. Civilians didn't know badge numbers, supervisory chains of command, or federal sentencing guidelines. Only someone with intimate knowledge of law enforcement procedures would have access to that kind of detailed information. Officer Jackson, a 15-year veteran, felt his stomach drop as the pieces began falling into place. The briefcase full of federal documents, the perfect legal terminology, the complete lack of fear in the face of armed officers, the way she carried herself with absolute authority, even while being physically restrained. "Oh my God," Jackson whispered to Martinez, "she's really a federal judge." Martinez, who had been filming the interaction on his body camera as per department protocol, suddenly realized that he was recording what might be the most catastrophic law enforcement failure in Georgia history. His hands began shaking as he understood that this footage would likely be evidence in a federal criminal trial. Sullivan, still pressing his knee into Judge Washington's back, finally heard something that penetrated his rage-clouded consciousness: the sound of multiple vehicles approaching at high speed with emergency lights activated. Federal courthouse security had been monitoring the situation from the moment it began. The Federal Protective Service, which provides security for all federal buildings and personnel, had protocols for exactly this type of situation. When a federal judge's safety was threatened, those protocols were activated automatically and without discussion. 3 black SUVs with federal plates surrounded the scene in less than 90 seconds. Federal agents in tactical gear emerged with weapons drawn, not pointing them at anyone, but making it clear that this situation had just escalated to a level that local police couldn't control. "Federal agents," announced Supervisory Special Agent Maria Santos from the U.S. Marshals Service, "release the individual immediately and step away from the vehicle." Sullivan looked up to see half a dozen federal agents surrounding him, their presence transforming what he had thought was a routine arrest into something that looked like a scene from a movie. For the first time since this encounter began, doubt crept into his consciousness. "This woman was interfering with—" Sullivan began. "Sir," Agent Santos interrupted, her voice carrying absolute authority, "that woman is Federal Judge Rebecca Washington. You need to remove your hands from her immediately and step back." The words Federal Judge Rebecca Washington hit Sullivan like a physical blow. He had heard that name before. Every law enforcement officer in Georgia knew that name. She was the judge who had sent corrupt cops to federal prison. She was the judge who had overseen the landmark civil rights cases that had reformed 3 different police departments. She was the judge who had the power to place entire law enforcement agencies under federal oversight. Sullivan's hands fell away from Judge Washington as if he had been electrocuted. The handcuffs he had been reaching for clattered to the ground. His face went from flushed red to ash white in the span of 3 seconds. Judge Washington straightened her jacket, picked up her scattered legal documents with the help of Officer Torres, and turned to face Sullivan with the calm dignity of someone who had just proven a point about power, authority, and the consequences of prejudice. What happened next would trigger an investigation that would expose corruption reaching the highest levels of the department. Because what Captain Sullivan didn't know was that assaulting a federal judge doesn't just end careers. It triggers federal protocols that can't be stopped, can't be covered up, and can't be ignored. And the evidence they were about to uncover would prove that this wasn't his first time. Within 6 minutes of Agent Santos identifying Judge Washington, a series of federal protocols began activating that would ultimately involve 4 different federal agencies: the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Federal Protective Service Protocol FPS 2847 required immediate notification of any threat to federal judicial personnel. U.S. Marshals Service Protocol USMS 1847 mandated full investigation of any physical assault on a federal judge. FBI Protocol FBI CR 2847 triggered automatic civil rights violation review for any use of force against federal officials by local law enforcement. Captain Sullivan stood frozen as he watched his career disintegrating in real time. Judge Washington, now surrounded by federal agents who treated her with the deference due to her position, began the process that would ultimately lead to his destruction. "Agent Santos," Judge Washington said, her voice returning to its normal judicial tone, "I'll need incident report number FBI 2847 ATL to be filed within the hour. Captain Sullivan violated 18 U.S.C. 242, 18 U.S.C. 245, and potentially 42 U.S.C. 1983. I'll also need the video evidence secured from courthouse cameras 7, 12, and 15, which have overlapping coverage of this entire incident." Sullivan watched in growing horror as Judge Washington demonstrated exactly how much power she wielded. She wasn't just reciting law, she was activating a federal machinery that he didn't even know existed. Every protocol she mentioned would generate reports that would be read by federal prosecutors. Every camera she referenced would provide evidence that couldn't be suppressed or destroyed. Officer Torres approached his captain with obvious reluctance. "Captain, we should probably contact Lieutenant Commander Morrison right away." Sullivan nodded numbly, finally understanding that this situation was completely beyond his control. But what he didn't know was that Lieutenant Commander Morrison had already been contacted, not by Sullivan's team, but by the Federal Protective Service, who had notification protocols that bypassed local command structures entirely. Morrison's phone had been ringing for 3 minutes when Sullivan finally called. "Morrison here. Lieutenant Commander, this is Captain Sullivan. We have a situation at the federal courthouse that—" "Sullivan," Morrison interrupted, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Please tell me you did not just assault Federal Judge Rebecca Washington." The silence on Sullivan's end told Morrison everything he needed to know. "Sullivan, where are you right now?" "I'm at the courthouse with federal agents and—" "Do not say another word over this radio channel," Morrison snapped. "I'm en route with legal counsel. Do not speak to anyone, do not make any statements, and do not leave the scene until I arrive." But Morrison knew it was already too late. Federal assault charges against police officers weren't handled by local prosecutors who might be willing to negotiate. They were handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office, where Judge Washington had personal relationships with every prosecutor, and where Sullivan's 20-year career meant absolutely nothing. Judge Washington was now speaking quietly with Agent Santos, providing a detailed account of the incident that would become the foundation for federal charges. Her memory for detail was legendary in legal circles. She could recall conversations verbatim years after they occurred, and her credibility with federal prosecutors was absolute. "Agent Santos, you should know that Captain Sullivan displayed a pattern of behavior that suggests this wasn't an isolated incident," Judge Washington said. "His immediate assumption that I was just another civilian who needed to be taught respect indicates systematic bias training issues within the department." Those words, systematic bias and training issues, were federal code for the kind of investigation that could place entire police departments under federal oversight. Sullivan, standing 20 feet away, could hear enough of the conversation to understand that Judge Washington wasn't just filing charges against him personally. She was triggering a comprehensive review of his entire department. Officer Martinez was still recording everything on his body camera, but now he understood that this footage wouldn't just be evidence in Sullivan's case. It would be evidence in a federal pattern and practice investigation that could last for years and result in court-ordered reforms for the entire police force. The other officers, Torres, Jackson, and Martinez, were beginning to realize that their own careers might be in jeopardy simply for being present during this catastrophic incident. Federal investigators would interview them separately, review their individual records, and determine whether they had enabled or participated in Sullivan's pattern of misconduct. But what they didn't realize was that everything was being recorded, not just by courthouse security, but by federal surveillance systems that capture every interaction on federal property, and these recordings can never be deleted or suppressed. Lieutenant Commander James Morrison arrived at the federal courthouse with the department's legal counsel, Attorney David Richardson, expecting to manage a relatively routine excessive force complaint. What they found instead was a federal crime scene with evidence technicians photographing skid marks on the pavement and agents collecting Judge Washington's scattered legal documents as evidence. Morrison had known Sullivan for 15 years. They had come up through the ranks together, covered for each other during internal affairs investigations, and shared an understanding about how to manage problematic complaints from the community. But seeing Sullivan standing next to his patrol car with federal agents documenting every inch of the scene, Morrison realized that their network of protection was about to be tested like never before. "Captain Sullivan," Morrison said carefully, aware that federal agents were recording every word, "you are relieved of duty pending investigation. Richardson will handle all communications from this point forward." Attorney Richardson was sweating despite the cool evening air. He specialized in police misconduct defense, but his experience was entirely with local prosecutors who might be willing to negotiate. Federal charges were a completely different world, a world where political considerations and professional relationships meant nothing, and where the evidence either supported charges or it didn't. "Your Honor," Richardson approached Judge Washington with obvious reluctance, "I'm David Richardson, representing Captain Sullivan. I was hoping we might discuss—" "Mr. Richardson," Judge Washington interrupted, "this is now a federal criminal matter. Any communications should go through the U.S. Attorney's Office." Richardson's face went pale. Federal criminal matter meant FBI investigation, federal grand jury, and potential federal prison time. It meant that Sullivan's case would be handled by federal prosecutors who specialized in civil rights violations and who viewed police misconduct as a priority area for prosecution. Agent Santos was now coordinating with FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who had just arrived from the Atlanta field office with a mobile forensic unit. The FBI's involvement meant that this case would receive the full resources of federal law enforcement, resources that could uncover patterns of misconduct going back decades. "Agent Walsh," Judge Washington said, "I believe you'll want to review Captain Sullivan's entire disciplinary record as part of your investigation. Based on his behavior tonight, I suspect you'll find a pattern of constitutional violations that his department has failed to address." Agent Walsh nodded, making notes that would trigger subpoenas for Sullivan's personnel file, internal affairs records, and every complaint filed against him in his 20-year career. Federal investigators had access to records that local oversight agencies often ignored or suppressed. Sullivan watched this conversation with growing desperation. He could see his entire life being systematically dismantled by federal agents who operated with resources and authority that local investigators couldn't match. Every complaint he thought had been buried, every witness who had been intimidated into silence, every piece of evidence that had mysteriously disappeared, all of it would be reviewed by federal agents who couldn't be influenced by local politics. Morrison was now coordinating with Chief of Police Robert Hayes, who had been awakened at home and informed that one of his captains had assaulted a federal judge. Hayes understood immediately that this incident would trigger federal oversight of his entire department, oversight that could result in court-ordered reforms, federal monitoring, and budget restrictions that would last for years. "Morrison," Hayes said over the phone, "I need a complete timeline of every complaint against Sullivan for the past 5 years. I need it by morning, and I need it to be comprehensive. The FBI is going to request it anyway, and I want to know what they're going to find before they find it." "Sorry, sir," but Morrison knew that compiling Sullivan's complete record would be like documenting a pattern of misconduct that the department had systematically ignored. Every complaint that had been dismissed, every witness interview that had been perfunctory, every internal investigation that had concluded with insufficient evidence, all of it would now be reviewed by federal agents who understood exactly how local departments protected problematic officers. Judge Washington was completing her statement to Agent Walsh, providing details that would form the foundation for federal charges. Her account was precise, comprehensive, and devastating, exactly what federal prosecutors needed to build an unbeatable case. "Agent Walsh," Judge Washington concluded, "I want to emphasize that Captain Sullivan's actions tonight were not the result of poor judgment or inadequate training. They were the result of systematic bias and a belief that his authority superseded federal law. That kind of mentality doesn't develop in isolation. It develops in departments that enable and protect it. The department thought they could contain this, But they had no idea how deep the corruption went, because Judge Washington had been quietly documenting patterns of police misconduct for years, and she had been waiting for the right moment to act. By 11:30 p.m., less than 3 hours after Sullivan had first grabbed Judge Washington's arm, federal prosecutors at the U.S. Attorney's Office were already reviewing preliminary evidence and preparing federal charges that would be filed within 48 hours. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres, no relation to Officer Torres, was the Civil Rights Division's specialist in police misconduct cases. He had successfully prosecuted 47 law enforcement officers for federal civil rights violations in his 12-year career. When his phone rang at 11:15 p.m. with news that a police captain had assaulted federal judge Rebecca Washington, Torres knew this would be the highest-profile case of his career. "Judge Washington," Torres said when he called her at home, "I've reviewed the preliminary FBI report. We'll be filing federal charges under 18 U.S.C. 242 and 18 U.S.C. 245. Given your status as a federal judge and the clear evidence of bias motivation, we'll be recommending the maximum penalty range." 18 U.S.C. 242 was the federal civil rights statute that prohibited deprivation of constitutional rights under color of law. 18 U.S.C. 245 was the federal hate crime statute that enhanced penalties when victims were targeted because of their race. Combined, these charges carried a maximum sentence of 15 years in federal prison. Judge Washington understood the significance of Torres's call. Federal prosecutors didn't call victims to discuss charging decisions unless they were completely confident in their ability to secure convictions. Torres was calling because he wanted Judge Washington to know that Sullivan would face the full weight of federal justice. Meanwhile, at FBI headquarters in Atlanta, Special Agent Walsh was compiling Sullivan's 20-year record of complaints, lawsuits, and disciplinary actions. What she discovered was a pattern of misconduct so comprehensive that it suggested systematic failure by the police department's oversight mechanisms. 43 complaints of excessive force, 27 allegations of racial bias, 15 lawsuits settled by the city with confidential agreements, 7 internal affairs investigations that concluded with insufficient evidence despite compelling witness testimony. A pattern of behavior that should have resulted in termination years ago, but had instead been enabled and protected by supervisors who valued loyalty over accountability. Agent Walsh's report would ultimately trigger a federal pattern and practice investigation under 42 U.S.C. 14141, which would place the entire police department under federal oversight and mandate comprehensive reforms that would cost millions of dollars and take years to implement. Sullivan, meanwhile, was at home in his suburban ranch house, staring at his police academy graduation photo and trying to understand how 20 years of what he considered successful law enforcement had led to this moment. His wife, Linda, was crying quietly in their bedroom, already understanding that their middle-class lifestyle, their children's college funds, and their retirement plans had been destroyed by one moment of racist arrogance. Sullivan's phone had been ringing constantly since word of the incident spread through the department. Fellow officers, supervisors, and union representatives all wanted to know what had happened and how bad the damage would be. But Sullivan couldn't explain how he had confused a federal judge for a random civilian, couldn't justify why he had used force against someone who had never threatened him, and couldn't rationalize why he had ignored every warning sign that should have told him to stop. The police union's attorney, Sarah Martinez, had reviewed the preliminary evidence and delivered news that shattered Sullivan's last hope. "Derek, this isn't a case we can defend. The evidence is overwhelming. The victim is a federal judge and the FBI has video of everything. My advice is to negotiate for the minimum sentence and hope the federal prosecutors are feeling generous." But federal prosecutors rarely felt generous when police officers violated the civil rights of federal judges. The U.S. Attorney's Office had a reputation to maintain, and prosecuting corrupt cops was always popular with voters and civil rights organizations. Chief Hayes was now meeting with the mayor, the city attorney, and federal mediators to discuss the terms of federal oversight that would be imposed on the department. The incident with Judge Washington had accelerated investigations that had been building for years, and the city was facing federal intervention that would reshape every aspect of police operations. "Chief," Mayor Patricia Johnson said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "I need to know how many more Derek Sullivans we have in this department, and I need to know how we're going to prevent this from happening again." Hayes knew the answer would be devastating. The department had dozens of officers with complaint patterns similar to Sullivan's, and preventing future incidents would require systemic changes that the department had resisted for decades. What the federal investigation uncovered would shock the entire nation, because Captain Sullivan's 20-year career wasn't built on good police work. It was built on intimidation, cover-ups, and a department that protected him at every turn. Federal investigators had been working for 18 hours straight when they uncovered evidence that transformed Sullivan's case from a single incident of misconduct into a federal conspiracy investigation involving multiple officers and supervisors. FBI agent Walsh had been analyzing Sullivan's personnel file when she noticed a pattern that made her stomach turn. Every single complaint against Sullivan had been investigated by the same internal affairs detective, Lieutenant Michael Foster. Every single investigation had concluded with insufficient evidence. Every single witness had mysteriously become unavailable or unreliable during the investigation process. Foster had been protecting Sullivan for 15 years, and their arrangement had generated millions of dollars in legal settlements that the city had paid to avoid federal scrutiny. Walsh's discovery meant that Foster would also face federal charges for conspiracy to violate civil rights under 18 U.S.C. 241. The evidence was overwhelming. Email records showed Foster had coached Sullivan on how to write incident reports that would withstand scrutiny. Phone records revealed coordination between Foster and Sullivan before internal affairs interviews. Financial records indicated that Sullivan had helped Foster obtain a promotion by providing false testimony in another officer's disciplinary hearing. At 2:30 a.m., federal agents arrested Lieutenant Foster at his home in Marietta, Georgia. The arrest warrant was based on evidence that Foster had systematically suppressed investigations into Sullivan's misconduct for over a decade. Foster's arrest meant that other officers who had participated in the cover-up network would also face federal charges. Judge Washington had been monitoring the investigation's progress through regular updates from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Each new revelation confirmed her understanding that Sullivan's behavior represented institutional failure, not individual misconduct. Assistant U.S. Attorney Torres, Judge Washington said during their morning phone call, "I want to ensure that this investigation addresses the systemic issues that enabled Captain Sullivan's behavior for 20 years. Individual prosecution is important, but institutional reform is essential." Torres understood that Judge Washington was positioning this case as a catalyst for comprehensive police reform. Her influence with federal oversight agencies would ensure that Sullivan's prosecution led to long-term changes in police accountability throughout Georgia. The local news media had picked up the story by morning, but they completely misunderstood its significance. Local reporters focused on Sullivan's arrest and the assault charges, missing the larger story of federal investigation into systematic police corruption. But national news organizations understood exactly what was happening. CNN's justice correspondent reported that the Sullivan case was likely to trigger the most comprehensive federal investigation of police misconduct in Georgia since the 1960s. The Washington Post's civil rights reporter described it as a textbook example of how individual incidents can expose institutional failures. Sullivan woke up in his suburban bedroom to discover that his name was trending on Twitter. His photograph was being shown on national television, and civil rights organizations were using his case as an example of everything wrong with American policing. Angela Davis, the renowned civil rights activist, issued a statement that captured the national significance. Captain Sullivan's assault on Judge Washington represents the collision between America's legacy of racial oppression and the constitutional authority that protects our democracy. When police officers believe they can assault federal judges with impunity, our entire system of justice is under attack. Sullivan's defense attorney, David Richardson, was struggling to find any viable defense strategy. Federal civil rights cases were notoriously difficult to defend because they focused on clear constitutional violations rather than complex legal interpretations. The evidence against Sullivan was captured on multiple cameras, witnessed by federal agents, and documented by one of the most respected judges in the federal system. "Derek," Richardson said during their morning meeting, "the federal prosecutors are offering a plea agreement, 7 years in federal prison in exchange for cooperation in the investigation of Lieutenant Foster and other officers. It's the best deal you're going to get." Sullivan stared at the plea agreement that would destroy everything he had built over 20 years. 7 years in federal prison meant losing his pension, his benefits, and any hope of future employment in law enforcement. But fighting the charges meant risking the maximum sentence of 15 years, and Richardson had made it clear that winning at trial was virtually impossible. The investigation was expanding beyond Sullivan and Foster to include other officers who had participated in the cover-up network. Federal agents were reviewing every case Sullivan had worked, every arrest he had made, and every incident report he had filed. Dozens of cases were being overturned as evidence of Sullivan's pattern of misconduct came to light. But the consequences were only beginning, because when the FBI investigates police misconduct, they don't just look at one officer, they examine the entire system that allowed him to operate unchecked for 2 decades. And what they found would expose corruption reaching the highest levels of city government. 6 weeks after the assault, the U.S. Attorney's Office filed a comprehensive federal indictment that shocked even experienced civil rights attorneys with its scope and detail. United States vs. Derek Sullivan, Michael Foster, and James Morrison included charges under 4 different federal statutes. Conspiracy to violate civil rights, 18 U.S.C. 241, deprivation of rights under color of law, 18 U.S.C. 242, hate crime violations, 18 U.S.C. 245, and racketeering conspiracy, 18 U.S.C. 1962. The racketeering charges were based on evidence that Sullivan, Foster, and Morrison had operated an organized scheme to protect each other from accountability while systematically violating citizens' constitutional rights. Federal prosecutors had documented over 200 incidents where the 3 men had covered up misconduct, falsified reports, and intimidated witnesses. Judge Washington attended the arraignment hearing, sitting in the public gallery as Sullivan, Foster, and Morrison were formally charged with federal crimes. The courtroom was packed with journalists, civil rights activists, and federal prosecutors who understood they were witnessing a historic moment in police accountability. Federal Judge Thomas Bradley, who presided over the arraignment, set bond conditions that effectively ended all 3 men's law enforcement careers immediately. Sullivan was required to surrender his badge, his weapon, and his law enforcement certification. He was prohibited from contact with any current or former police officers who might be witnesses in the case. "Mr. Sullivan," Judge Bradley said from the bench, "the allegations in this indictment describe a pattern of behavior that strikes at the heart of our constitutional system. The court considers you a significant flight risk and a danger to the community." Sullivan's bond was set at $500,000, secured by his house and requiring GPS monitoring. The conditions meant he would spend the months before trial under house arrest, watching his former colleagues testify against him in exchange for reduced sentences. The psychological impact on Sullivan was devastating. 20 years of believing he was untouchable had been shattered by one moment of contact with someone who possessed real authority. He spent his days under house arrest, reading news coverage of his case, watching former partners distance themselves from him, and realizing that his entire identity as a law enforcement officer had been built on systematic violations of the law he was supposed to protect. Linda Sullivan filed for divorce within 2 weeks of the arraignment. Their children changed their last names to avoid association with their father's crimes. Sullivan's police pension was suspended, pending the outcome of federal charges, leaving him financially dependent on relatives who were increasingly reluctant to help. Judge Washington, meanwhile, was working with federal oversight agencies to implement comprehensive reforms in the police department. Her recommendations would become the template for federal intervention in law enforcement agencies nationwide. The Sullivan case represents an opportunity to transform police accountability, Judge Washington told the Federal Monitor, appointed to oversee departmental reforms. "We must ensure that this type of systematic misconduct never again receives institutional protection." The reforms Judge Washington advocated were revolutionary: mandatory body cameras for all officers, independent oversight of excessive force complaints, federal review of all use of force incidents, and automatic termination for officers with patterns of misconduct. These changes would cost the city millions of dollars, but would prevent future Derek Sullivans from operating with impunity. Federal prosecutors were also pursuing civil asset forfeiture against Sullivan's property, arguing that his house and savings had been purchased with income from his corrupt law enforcement career. The forfeiture action meant that even if Sullivan somehow avoided prison time, he would lose everything he had accumulated over 20 years. The national civil rights community was watching Sullivan's case as a test of federal commitment to police accountability. Organizations like the NAACP, the American Civil Liberties Union, and the Southern Poverty Law Center filed amicus briefs supporting maximum sentences and comprehensive reforms. Reverend Al Sharpton issued a statement that captured the broader significance. Derek Sullivan thought he could assault a federal judge because he had spent 20 years assaulting citizens without consequences. Federal prosecution is the only way to break the cycle of police impunity that has protected officers like Sullivan for generations. But the consequences were only beginning, because losing his job was just the start. Captain Sullivan was about to face federal criminal charges that carried a minimum of 10 years in prison, and Judge Washington had one final move that would ensure he could never hurt anyone again. The federal pattern and practice investigation, triggered by Sullivan's assault, had uncovered evidence of corruption so extensive that the Department of Justice placed the entire police force under federal oversight, only the fourth time in U.S. history that such drastic action had been taken. Federal Monitor Dr. Sarah Chen, a former federal prosecutor who specialized in police reform, was appointed to oversee comprehensive changes that would reshape every aspect of law enforcement operations. Her mandate included complete restructuring of internal affairs, implementation of community oversight mechanisms, and federal review of all hiring and promotion decisions. The evidence uncovered in the Sullivan investigation reveals institutional failure at every level, Dr. Chen announced at her first public meeting. This department has systematically protected officers who violated citizens' constitutional rights, while retaliating against officers who attempted to report misconduct. The financial cost of federal oversight was staggering. The city was required to pay for Dr. Chen's team of federal monitors, implement new training programs for all officers, upgrade technology systems to ensure accountability, and settle hundreds of civil rights lawsuits that had been filed as the scope of departmental corruption became clear. Mayor Patricia Johnson faced a budget crisis that threatened city services, as millions of dollars were redirected to comply with federal oversight requirements. The political consequences were swift. 3 city council members who had supported the police department's resistance to reform were recalled by voters who demanded accountability. Judge Washington was appointed to the Federal Advisory Committee on Police Reform, a position that gave her national influence over law enforcement accountability policies. Her experience with the Sullivan case made her a leading expert on how federal oversight could transform corrupt police departments. The Sullivan case proves that individual prosecution must be combined with institutional reform, Judge Washington testified before Congress. We cannot simply arrest corrupt officers. We must dismantle the systems that protect and enable their corruption. Her congressional testimony led to the Federal Police Accountability Act, legislation that would require all law enforcement agencies receiving federal funding to implement oversight mechanisms similar to those developed in response to Sullivan's crimes. Sullivan's former colleagues were cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for reduced sentences, providing evidence of corruption that reached the highest levels of city government. The investigation expanded to include city council members who had blocked police reform, prosecutors who had refused to file charges against problem officers, and judges who had dismissed cases based on prosecutorial pressure rather than evidence. Officer Torres, the rookie who had witnessed Sullivan's assault on Judge Washington, became a federal whistleblower whose testimony helped convict 17 additional officers of civil rights violations. His cooperation agreement included federal witness protection and relocation assistance, recognition that testifying against corrupt colleagues had made him a target for retaliation. Torres did what every police officer swears to do, Judge Washington said at his commendation ceremony. He chose to protect and serve the Constitution rather than protect and serve corruption. The police union that had initially defended Sullivan was forced to implement new policies prohibiting the defense of officers charged with federal civil rights violations. Union leadership was replaced by reformers who committed to supporting accountability rather than impunity. Federal oversight was producing measurable results. Excessive force complaints dropped by 67%, citizen satisfaction with police services increased by 45%, and federal prosecutors reported a significant reduction in civil rights violations by law enforcement officers. But the human cost of Sullivan's crimes continued to mount. Families who had been victimized by Sullivan during his 20-year career were filing civil rights lawsuits seeking millions of dollars in damages. Each lawsuit provided additional evidence of the systematic failure that had enabled Sullivan's behavior. Maria Rodriguez, whose son had been brutalized by Sullivan 3 years earlier, testified at federal hearings about the long-term impact of police misconduct. "My son still has nightmares about what Officer Sullivan did to him. But knowing that Sullivan will never hurt another family gives us some peace." The transformation was not without resistance. Police officers who had benefited from the old system of impunity organized protests against federal oversight, claiming that accountability measures were making law enforcement impossible. But community support for reform was overwhelming, and political leaders who opposed federal oversight were voted out of office. The changes were revolutionary, but Captain Sullivan's personal reckoning was still coming, because Judge Washington had one final move that would ensure he could never hurt anyone again. On a cold morning in February, 8 months after he had assaulted Judge Washington, Derek Sullivan stood before federal Judge Thomas Bradley to receive a sentence that would destroy what remained of his life. The federal courthouse was packed with civil rights activists, victims of Sullivan's abuse, and journalists covering what had become the most significant police accountability case in Georgia history. Judge Washington sat in the front row, a visible reminder of the dignity and authority that Sullivan had tried to violate. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres presented evidence that painted Sullivan as the centerpiece of a corrupt network that had victimized hundreds of citizens over 2 decades. The sentencing memorandum included victim impact statements from 47 people who had been brutalized, falsely arrested, or intimidated by Sullivan and his Confederates. "Your Honor," Torres said, "Derek Sullivan used his badge and gun to terrorize citizens who couldn't fight back. He believed that his uniform made him untouchable, that his authority superseded the Constitution, and that his victims were powerless to hold him accountable. He was wrong on every count." Sullivan's defense attorney made a final, desperate plea for leniency, arguing that Sullivan had been a product of systemic problems rather than individual malice. But federal Judge Bradley had reviewed 20 years of evidence showing that Sullivan had been the architect of the corruption, not its victim. "Mr. Sullivan," Judge Bradley said, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority, "you have been convicted of crimes that strike at the foundation of our democratic system. Police officers who violate citizens' constitutional rights are not law enforcement. They are criminals who happen to wear badges." The sentence was devastating. 12 years in federal prison, 3 years of supervised release, forfeiture of all assets obtained through corrupt activities, and permanent prohibition from any law enforcement employment. Sullivan would serve his time in federal facilities designed for corrupt government officials, where his fellow inmates would include other police officers, politicians, and public servants who had betrayed their oaths. Judge Washington watched Sullivan's sentencing with the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice delivered through proper constitutional processes. But her focus was already shifting to the systemic changes that would prevent future Derek Sullivans from operating with impunity. "This sentence sends a clear message," Judge Washington told reporters after the hearing. "No one is above the law. Not police officers, not public officials, and certainly not those who use their authority to violate the rights they swore to protect." Sullivan's personal destruction was complete. His wife had divorced him and moved to another state with their children. His house had been seized through federal forfeiture proceedings. His police pension had been terminated. His law enforcement certification had been permanently revoked. Friends and family members had distanced themselves from him to avoid association with his crimes. The psychological impact was evident as Sullivan was led away in shackles. The man who had spent 20 years believing he was untouchable now faced 12 years in federal prison, where his status as a corrupt police officer would make him a target for violence from inmates who had been victimized by law enforcement. Lieutenant Foster received 10 years in federal prison for his role in covering up Sullivan's crimes. Lieutenant Commander Morrison received 8 years for participating in the conspiracy. 17 other officers received sentences ranging from probation to 5 years in prison for their roles in the corruption network. The federal investigation had ultimately resulted in the prosecution of 23 law enforcement officers, the largest police corruption case in Georgia history. The financial cost to the city exceeded $50 million in federal oversight expenses, civil rights settlements, and reform implementation. Judge Washington's role in exposing this corruption earned her national recognition as a champion of police accountability. She received the Civil Rights Award from the NAACP, the Justice Award from the American Civil Liberties Union, and was featured on the cover of Time magazine as one of the most influential people fighting government corruption. But for Judge Washington, the real victory was not the awards or recognition. It was the knowledge that systematic reforms would protect future victims from experiencing what she had endured in that courthouse parking lot. The federal monitoring of the police department would continue for 5 years, ensuring that the changes were permanent rather than temporary. New officers were trained in constitutional law and civil rights. Supervisors were held accountable for their subordinates' behavior. Community oversight provided external accountability that prevented the return of corrupt practices. But the most powerful moment was yet to come, because Judge Washington's response to this assault would inspire federal legislation that would change police accountability forever. 1 year after Derek Sullivan's assault had triggered the largest police reform in Georgia history, Judge Washington stood before the United States Senate Judiciary Committee to testify about legislation that would transform police accountability nationwide. The Federal Police Accountability Act, inspired directly by the Sullivan case, would require all law enforcement agencies receiving federal funding to implement oversight mechanisms, body camera requirements, and independent investigation procedures for excessive force complaints. The legislation represented the most comprehensive police reform in American history. Senators, Judge Washington testified, Derek Sullivan's assault on my dignity was also an assault on the constitutional principles that govern our democracy. But his crime became an opportunity to demonstrate that our system of justice, when properly applied, can hold even the most powerful accountable and protect even the most vulnerable. The committee room was silent as Judge Washington described the systematic corruption that had protected Sullivan for 20 years and the federal intervention that had finally brought justice. Her testimony was broadcast live on national television, watched by millions of Americans who understood they were witnessing a historic moment in civil rights. Senator Elizabeth Warren asked the question that captured the national significance. Judge Washington, what would have happened if you had been an ordinary citizen rather than a federal judge when Captain Sullivan assaulted you? Judge Washington's answer was devastating in its simplicity. Senator, Derek Sullivan had assaulted ordinary citizens for 20 years without facing any consequences. The only difference was that I had the authority to trigger federal intervention and the knowledge to ensure that intervention was effective. That exchange became the defining moment of the hearings, crystallizing public understanding that police accountability required external oversight rather than internal investigation. The Federal Police Accountability Act passed the Senate by a vote of 78-22, with bipartisan support that reflected national consensus on the need for reform. President Biden signed the legislation into law 6 months later, with Judge Washington standing beside him as he used multiple pens to ensure that pieces of the signing could be distributed to civil rights organizations across the country. This law ensures that what happened to Judge Washington and what Derek Sullivan did to hundreds of victims over 20 years can never again receive institutional protection, President Biden said at the signing ceremony. The Sullivan case had become a template for federal intervention in corrupt law enforcement agencies. The Department of Justice used the precedent to place 12 additional police departments under federal oversight, applying the same comprehensive reforms that had transformed Sullivan's department. Derek Sullivan was serving his federal sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Coleman, Florida, a medium security facility that housed corrupt government officials. Prison records indicated that he had been attacked twice by inmates who had been victimized by police officers, confirming the dangers faced by law enforcement officers who became federal prisoners. His appeals had been denied by every court, including the Supreme Court, which refused to hear his case. Legal experts noted that Sullivan's conviction was so clear-cut and the evidence so overwhelming that no appellate court was willing to question federal prosecutors' handling of the case. Judge Washington continued her work on police reform through her position on the Federal Advisory Committee, helping to implement the accountability mechanisms that would prevent future Derek Sullivans from operating with impunity. Her recommendations were being implemented in law enforcement agencies across the country. The financial settlements with Sullivan's victims totaled over $30 million, paid by the city through insurance policies that had become prohibitively expensive as a result of the systematic misconduct. The insurance crisis forced additional reforms as companies refused to cover law enforcement agencies without comprehensive accountability measures. Maria Rodriguez, whose son had been brutalized by Sullivan, spoke at the Federal Police Accountability Act signing ceremony. Judge Washington showed us that dignity and courage can overcome hatred and corruption. Because of her strength, my son will grow up in a world where police officers know they will be held accountable for their actions. The transformation was visible in crime statistics, community relations, and officer behavior. The police department that had once protected Derek Sullivan was now recognized as a national model for constitutional law enforcement, with community trust ratings that were the highest in the region. Judge Washington's final words at the Senate hearing captured the lasting significance of her encounter with Derek Sullivan. What began as one man's racist assault has become a catalyst for constitutional transformation. We have proven that our system of justice, properly applied, can protect the vulnerable, hold the powerful accountable, and ensure that badge and uniform serve the Constitution rather than corrupt those who wear them. And that's how one moment of racist aggression against a federal judge destroyed a 20-year career, exposed systematic corruption, triggered comprehensive reform, and proved that in America, no one, absolutely no one, is above the law. Derek Sullivan thought he could assault Judge Washington with impunity. Instead, he learned that some people hold power he never imagined, and disrespecting them carries consequences that will follow him for the rest of his life. Thanks to everyone who typed respect, justice, and inspired in the comments. Your engagement proves that stories of dignity and accountability matter. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more incredible tales of courage triumphing over corruption. Until next time, remember that no one is above the law, and sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply refusing to back down.